Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be covering the topic of periodization and management of training load for athletic performance and injury prevention. So first we need to establish what we mean by training load. Essentially, training load is the amount or the volume of training an athlete or a team does. And this can be measured in various different ways depending on the type of training we're doing. So for example, for speed training, we're probably going to quantify the training load as the number of sprints performed or the total distance of the sprints we perform. Whereas with strength training, we may use volume load, so sets times reps, or sets times reps times load. We may use repetition volume, so the total number of repetitions, or we could simply calculate the number of sets. There's various different ways to calculate training load. For endurance type training, the best measure is probably just going to be distance. And for field sports, we have various metrics we can use from GPS devices. So we could use distance or distance times average speed as a measure of load, the number of accelerations and decelerations, and some GPSs have different metrics such as player load, which may be a combination of some of these other variables. Or we may look at more than one metric to calculate our training load. So now that we've established what training load is, we can now move on to how we're going to manage that training load. So from the most acute sense, the per session training load, we need to first understand how to manage that. So during an individual training session, the higher the training load is, the less net adaptation we get per unit of training load. And I've used this graph to help make that concept more clear. So this is a theoretical graph. On the vertical axis, we have adaptation, and on the horizontal axis, we have in-session training load. And the area under this curve equals the net adaptation that we get from training. So we can see even if we do a really small amount of training, as long as we do something, then we get a good response from that small amount of training load. And the greater the training load is, the less of a net response and adaptation we get. So if our training load is at this point here, we get a good return for that amount of training. Whereas if our training load is really high, the response we get from that increased training load is probably not as much. And to illustrate this point, let's say, for example, we theoretically have a low in-session training load, which means that this area under the curve here is the net adaptation we get. So as we can see, although the training load is not that high, we still get quite a large amount of area of adaptation. Whereas if we double that training load around here, the total amount of adaptation we get is this block plus this block here. And as we can see, there's more area in this first training block with the smaller training load than with this second block here. But the more we do, the more collectively we get. So essentially, the more training load we do, yes, the more adaptation we get, but there is diminishing returns with the amount of training load that we do. And to illustrate this point further, if we again double this training load, we probably only get maybe 1/2 more adaptation than we already had. We're now going to have a look at the acute to chronic workload ratio. So essentially, the research shows that spikes in workload are going to put an athlete at a higher risk of injury. So basically what that's saying is if we look at the acute workload, so for example, the work we do in 1 week or 1 session, compared to the chronic workload, so the work we've done throughout the last 4 to 6 weeks, if we have a very high acute ratio, that is going to put us at a higher risk of injury. So if we have a look at this example here, we have athlete A in the blue line and athlete B in the orange line, and we're showing in this graph the training load over time, and in this case I've put weeks. So athlete A has a very gradual and slow progression in training load over these 12 weeks, whereas athlete B has more of a jagged progression in training load. So we can see it's not very smooth, and there are peaks and valleys here and there along the way, although the trend is still going up. So athlete B is probably going to be at a higher risk of injury at points like week 7 here, because of this idea of the acute to chronic workload ratio. So if we have a look at the training load in week 7 compared with the average training load we've done over the last 4 to 6 weeks, it is a much greater training load, and that's where we're likely to get injured as athletes. So essentially the take-home point here is that we want to ensure that we have a very gradual progression in workload, and we want to avoid any spikes in workload. And these spikes can be either peaks or also low points. On a similar topic to the acute to chronic workload ratio, we're now going to have a look at chronic training loads. So essentially what we're referring to with chronic training loads is the average amount of workload we do over a long period of time. So it's been shown in research that higher chronic training loads have the potential to reduce injury risk. And this is theorized to be due to the fact that high chronic training loads are going to increase the ability to tolerate intense periods of training or competition. So for example, if we're a team sport athlete and we have a competitive match every week, if our chronic training loads through the rest of the week are only going to be 50% of what we do in a competition, then those competitions are going to be a big spike in training load, which, as we know from the acute to chronic workload ratios, is going to put us at a higher risk of injury. So essentially the high chronic training loads are maintaining our general adaptations so that the competitions or the intense training periods we do are less of a spike to our training load. The other important point is to know that very high chronic training loads will probably increase our risk of injury. And that's just because every athlete has a point at which if you push them more, they will break and get injured. So if we have extremely high chronic training loads, we may actually be putting the athletes at a higher risk of injury. So if we have a look at this graph here, we have 3 athletes, athlete A in the blue, B in the orange, and C in the gray line. And we have 3 different chronic workloads over a 12-week time period. So athlete A has a pretty consistent workload, which is quite low over the 12 weeks. Athlete B has a very high chronic workload over the 12 weeks and doesn't really change too much, whereas athlete C has a slow and steady progression upwards, which is sort of in the middle. It's not low and it's not very high. So of these 3 athletes, athlete C is probably the least likely to get injured over this 12-week period according to chronic training loads. And that's because they have a progressively high chronic training load, but it's not so high that we're breaking the athletes, and it's not so low that our competitions are going to be a big spike in our training load. So we want to ensure that the athletes are doing enough work relative to their competition, but not so much that it's going to break them. We're now going to have a look at how we can manage our training load through the microcycle. So I have an example here of a training microcycle for a soccer player or a soccer team. The first thing to note is up here we have the days of the week, Monday through to Sunday. And I've put in here both our soccer practice and soccer matches, as well as strength and conditioning training. So a typical week may look something like this: soccer practice on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, with a match on Saturday, and then an active recovery session on Sunday. And then on the Tuesday and Thursday, where we don't have soccer practice, we may have some strength training. In this graph here, I have the training loads for both the soccer practices and the strength training, because they're going to use different methods of calculating training load. So with our soccer practice, this is a theoretical example. The actual training load we measure may be based on distances traveled using GPS data, and strength training may simply be on volume load. So the first thing we need to establish is our soccer match, and that's going to have, relative to the rest of the week, a fairly high training load. So we obviously want to be quite fresh for this soccer match, so we're not going to do very high training loads the day before, for example, or during our active recovery session after the game. So the rest of the week, we probably want to distribute our training load logically sequenced to make us perform well during this soccer match here. So we have our 3 soccer practice sessions, and we may distribute the training load through these sessions as the Monday having training loads around the same as what we would in a soccer match, the Wednesday being an even higher training load than what we would see in a soccer match, and the Friday a very low training load in order to make sure we're fresh for the soccer game the next day. So this might be more of a technical session with not much running, whereas this session on Wednesday may involve lots of running in order to get that training load up. And the reason we want a higher training load, at least one session throughout the week, than our soccer match, is so that we're physically adapted so that this soccer match is less of a total stress on the athletes, since we're already used to every week training at even higher training loads than the match. And then finally, our active recovery session is obviously going to be very low volume, but we don't want to be doing nothing. We're going to make sure we do something in order to actually speed up the recovery process. So as we can see, this is undulated in a way that's going to be most beneficial for our match on Saturday. Now, with only 2 strength training sessions in the week, we're obviously going to have no load on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. But we may do 1 session with slightly higher training loads and 1 session with slightly lower training loads. And this could probably go either way. The higher training loads could either be on Tuesday or on Thursday. It probably wouldn't make much of a difference. It depends on how the athletes feel and what exactly you're going to do in that training session. But we probably want to have 1 with slightly lower training loads and 1 with slightly higher training loads. And since the last strength training session is 2 days before the next soccer match, it's probably not going to impact our performance on the day to a very high extent. Nonetheless, it's still important to get some decent amount of training load in through the week for our strength training, more so for robustness and injury prevention. When managing our training load throughout the mesocycle or in the intermediate term, we can either increase our training load or we can also decrease our training load. So in this graph here, we have fitness, fatigue, and performance over time, assuming that training load is increasing over this time. So as our training load increases, our fitness slowly increases with our training load because we're doing more, we're getting more adaptation. However, our fatigue also increases and at a faster rate than our fitness. So as our load continues to increase over weeks and weeks and months, our fitness is going to increase, but our fatigue is going to accumulate even faster, which means in terms of performance, we're going to see some increases over time, followed by a plateau and potentially even decreases in performance when our fatigue accumulates really high. So basically, even though our fitness is increasing, our fatigue is increasing faster, and that's going to mask the adaptations we're getting, and our performance may actually be plateaued or decreased. So in order to actually make our performance greater, we need to decrease our training load in order to decrease our fatigue. So that brings us on to the next point, which is decreasing our training load. So in this graph here, we have the same thing, fitness, fatigue, and performance over time. This time we're going to assume that our training load is decreasing. So since our training load is decreasing, we're probably going to have reductions in fitness levels because we're not doing as much and we don't have that stimulus for adaptation. So our fitness will slightly reduce over time, but fatigue will also reduce at an even faster rate. So fatigue will drop off rapidly, and then eventually we will have not much fatigue and it won't reduce much anymore. So what will happen with our performance is that initially, especially for short periods of time, our performance will spike up and we'll get a good increase in performance. However, our performance is likely then to go down since our fitness is continuing to drop off and our fatigue has already dropped off quite a bit and doesn't have much more left that it can reduce. So we need to plan when we are going to increase our training loads and when we're going to decrease our training loads in order to make sure we're performing the best when it counts. Taking all the previous slides into consideration, we can now create a plan for our load management for the entire training year. So here I have an example of an annual plan of a typical team sport or field sport. So we firstly look here, we have the months of the year and the weeks of the year. And in this row here, we have competitive matches. So each little yellow box indicates a match that week, and the darker the box, the more important the match. Whereas the lighter the yellow, the less important the match is. So we have our seasonal matches here with some more important than others, and we have a few pre-season matches which are less important. So most of the important matches are towards the end of the season, which may be playoffs or finals of some sort. The year is then broken down into the pre-season period, starting at the end of the year and going through the start of the year, followed by the in-season period and then an off-season period. And not entirely relevant to this video, but I've also split the year up into training blocks. So we can now start to get an idea of how we're going to distribute our workload throughout the calendar year. So starting here in the off season, we're going to have no real workload prescribed by the management of the club. They may do things outside of that, but it is outside the club's control. And from there, when we go into the early preseason, we're probably going to start accumulating workload in order to get ourselves prepared for the upcoming season. So again, we want a nice gradual increase in workload. And since we don't have any important competitive matches coming up, we can get away with having quite a high workload and being under quite a bit of fatigue, since we don't need to perform at our best at this current time. So as the preseason goes on and nears closer to the in-season, we're probably going to start to reach our peak load, which means that we're probably not going to perform quite our best at the start of the season, but the trade-off may be necessary in order to perform our best in matches that we need to be at our best. And we still want to remember to keep a high chronic training load through the year in order to make sure that we're not losing fitness throughout the year. So as we have a few important matches towards the first half of the season, we may want to drop down volume slightly in order to be a little bit fresher and perform a bit better at these matches. So we can drop volume off for a little bit of time, and after this period of more important matches, we may slowly start to increase the workload once again. And this may increase nice and gradually up until the point where we have some more important matches towards the end of the year, where we really need to be at our best. So we're still increasing our workload and we're still maintaining and improving our fitness levels. And as we drop the workload down towards the end of the season, we should be able to drop most of that fatigue while ensuring our fitness is still quite high. So it's ultimately a balancing act between maintaining our fitness levels and dropping fatigue when we need to, but not spending too much time dropping the workload, otherwise we will lose fitness throughout the year and increase our risk of injury. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.